Hey Rob,
What's going on, Brian?
not much, man. I'm excited to be back for officially episode 1
Official episode one.
of Casually Curious.
A podcast where we can get casual and always curious.
Get casual, get curious about whatever the fuck we want to get casually curious about.
Whatever you're curious about, you can find it here. And you can find
only,
it.
only here. Don't look anywhere else.
You have to go to the casual section.
So, for episode 1, I think it would be natural to talk about the nature of the number 1. And the natural numbers. What is 1? All right, just
Definitely
kidding. Just kidding. So we're not doing numbers. We are
not doing
doing
numbers.
something a lot easier, which is consciousness.
Consciousness. You have it, Brian. I have it. Maybe.
We're just really gonna drop this one on you guys, anyone who's casually curious. But I thought it was sort of it made sense because it's sort of the most glaringly obvious thing to be curious about. I mean, it's just so crazy.
It's intuitive in the sense that it's it's natural for everyone to acknowledge their own consciousness, at least humans. So everyone can relate to it.
Yeah, you kind of have to. I wonder if there's anyone who's never wondered about their own consciousness. You know? Like, do you think it's possible to go your entire life and just not ever, like, have that little quick feedback loop of, like, what the hell is this thing that I'm doing here? You know what I mean?
Who am I listening to every time I think?
Right.
Why am I thinking? These are questions I hope everyone asks at some point in their life. I mean, I think it leads someone to a life of philosophy if they think seriously about those questions.
Right, right. But it's like sort of just a natural tendency for I would have to assume most people, you know. I mean, especially when we're younger, we have these natural sort of philosophical queries going on in the background without knowing that these are philosophical things we're thinking. But like, I'm wondering, just with consciousness being such a base, you know, obviously we're all humans, so we share whatever this weird thing is, whatever this strange condition is, the human condition, which I think, all right, is it just me, or when you hear about the human condition, to me I'm usually thinking it's closely associated with, if not being in direct referral to, consciousness, this weird thing.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I never like thought the two to be synonymous. I never thought human condition equals consciousness, but
Right.
I think consciousness is an essential component of the human condition.
Prerequisite in a way.
I don't know if it's pre. I was just thinking that. I don't know if it's a primordial condition, but definitely
What does mordial mean? Primordial.
just coming
Oh,
coming
like
preceding pre-existing is the word you use. It's very similar.
like the primordial soup, like I've heard that. Yeah.
That's Dawkins's term.
Yeah, the primordial soup. Yeah, yeah.
That's Richard Dawkins' term.
Oh wow, you
Uh,
really stuck the mordial for me. Like I've really I've never even, like, it sounded so primordial. I like that.
yeah, primordial. Uh, it's a phrase Nietzsche uses a lot, and
Oh really?
you're gonna find it a lot in Heidegger too when he's talking about where things stem from, because he's always looking for the origin of things, the very baseline
Right, right.
of all the ideas. So he uses the word primordial a lot because that's like it means it comes before it, but you can't think of it spatially. It's
Right.
just
Right,
existing
right.
before. It's the grounds, if you will, for whatever that idea is.
Wow. So yeah, so consciousness I thought would be a good start because it is just, I don't know, it's so crazy, and it's so
Relatable.
right, right. I mean, we're all afflicted with this thing that is consciousness, and it's, in a way, it binds us all together. in this human condition, because being empathetic, or at least maybe not empathetic in the sort of normative way or the moral sort of baggage that comes with, but being empathetic, maybe being aware of other people, is always a process of what would it be like to be that other person? How is this person reacting? What, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes is usually the term used. And it's sort of a pretty basic prescription, is in order to understand someone, if they're showing signs of something that you've never encountered, then you should attempt to sort of get outside of your own body and embody that person's perspective. And that, in a way, is just the sharing of consciousness in whatever sense that happens to mean. But it seems like to me that that's a pretty basic thing that most people would understand, would be familiar with, right?
Absolutely. I love how you use that idiom that really shows how we kind of just naturally think of this thing. It's right there in our language, with being able to walk a mile in someone's shoes, something we've all heard from someone before.
Right.
And it shows, if we can imagine, and you look at like a movie, this is going to sound so, like if you look at a movie like Freaky Friday.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just putting your thoughts and your experiences
right.
in the body of someone else.
Wow.
It's something we've always imagined.
What a philosophically deep movie that is. Freaky Friday, known for its philosophical richness and cutting critique against the mind-body dualistic perspective. That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah,
what is it? Lindsay
unexpected.
Lohan and who's the other one?
Jamie Lee Curtis.
Jamie Lee Curtis, right?
Yeah, and then that guy from NCIS.
Oh, who's the dad?
Yeah.
The dad in it?
Well,
wow. I haven't seen that movie in a long time.
Yeah. Anyway.
Freaky Friday, a perfect.
Yeah. So as proven in Freaky Friday, one has consciousness.
So I guess that's sort of that process of sort of attempting to inhabit someone else's perspectives, but in a more raw sense, inhabit someone's sense of consciousness and their experience of consciousness. So I think that's one maybe interesting thing, something that I think about, even without recognizing that it might be explicitly something to do with consciousness. But I guess another thing would be the difference between wakefulness and being asleep. So I think everyone understands what it is to have a sleepless or a dreamless sleep, right? So you sort of close your eyes when you go to bed, and then all of a sudden you're opening your eyes and you're waking up, and the past however long, it's tough to tell, was just not there. You weren't there. You weren't present. You were not around from the conscious perspective. I think that's sort of a strange thing, is maybe every night what percentage of the planet is saying goodbye to the conscious experience and entering into something other than that, which is sort of non-conscious. That's another thing that we all share.
What about dreams though? Because where do they play in with consciousness?
Well, I think dreams are certainly a form of consciousness, some sort of flavor of consciousness. And
so even while we're sleeping, we still have the conscious experience.
Sure. Well, that's why I said, dreamless, because you have to get around that. And that definitely happens also. Anesthesia. It's an anesthesiologist. Isn't that their job, is to make sure that you are having no dreams? I could only imagine what sort of strange dreams would be happening there. I heard some case of someone who went under, but they were still awake and had to sit through their own surgical procedure, not
With their
being
eyes
able to,
closed?
I don't know if, yeah, I don't know if they like couldn't open their eye. I think they must have not been able to open their eyes because then obviously the surgeons would have noticed. But that's pretty
Damn,
freaky. That could be
fucking
bullshit.
suck.
That's probably fake news. That's fake news. Don't quote me
That's
on
terrible.
that.
No, I'm sure that's happened, but I just don't see how you wouldn't be able to signal to the doctors that you were still awake
All right.
if they were.
You just fucking blinking as hard as you can,
Stop!
trying to get
Please
someone's
stop!
attention. They're all just huddled over your dick, just fucking cutting it open. You're just, no! Why do I have to witness this? Oh my
Stop the
god.
procedure. I've changed my mind.
Yeah, okay, so let's hope that's not true. Let's hope that's never happened to anyone. But
I
anyway,
wish that on my worst enemy.
all right, on to the next example of consciousness. So I guess, I don't know, when I, before I sort of was philosophically made aware of the more technical problem of consciousness that philosophers deal with, I always associated the mystery of consciousness with the degree to which it separates human beings and the human realm
Yeah,
from the realm of animals and from the animal kingdom.
I'm very curious about that.
Right. That distinction, if there is one.
Hmm.
To me, it seems that there's some sort of obvious, well, I think to everyone on some level, there's an obvious distinction because here we are communicating across time and space in a fraction of a second because information, a combination of ones and zeros, are somehow able to take the image of us and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going down all that way, there's this sort of abstracted realm in which human beings occupy that is abstract and consists in symbols and consists in representations and consists in all of these different steps of stepping outside of your animal self, let's say. Because, of course, we all have sex, we engage in violence, we get hungry, we do have to sleep, we
Piss and poop.
piss and shit and take a whiz every once in a while. Um,
Yeah.
Fight or flight, all of the things that maybe evolutionary psychology deals with, trying to explain psychological phenomena from an evolutionary perspective, is very much a reality, while at the same time, there's something that it is very much not like evolutionary mechanisms for someone to be conscious. So anyway, this also just to sort of introduce how there are so many different dimensions to the problem of consciousness, and what is it that we are trying to explain when someone proposes a theory of consciousness, and is it even possible to encapsulate all of the heterogeneous, all the way over here, all the way over there, this very amorphous sort of condition. Maybe that's what the human condition is, a more apt descriptor of this really mixed bag of phenomena.
Right.
And to encapsulate all of that in one theory of consciousness is like, holy fuck, that is
It's tough.
difficult.
And if I can try and segue to our author
Yeah,
of the evening
sure.
with with this statement, I've always thought of consciousness as this like crazy thing that you never be able to describe. And then when I got to college and I started taking a lot of undergraduate philosophy courses, I was learning about reductionist philosophy.
Right.
And reductionism is just the idea that everything can be broken down to like, electrons and neutrons and protons, right? Just fucking science in its most material and physical sense can explain natural phenomena in any way. So then I always thought that was the other end of the spectrum, right? Psychology and neuroscience, like these two.
Mm,
These two, like neuroscience grew out of psychology, and now we feel like it's replaced psychology in many ways.
mm,
So I've always thought of consciousness as this. I just didn't know that people thought this way about things like consciousness. That I thought that reductionists would assume that consciousness could be explained by just the synapses firing in your brain and the neurons doing their thing up there. And I don't know a lot about neuroscience, so you'll hear me use a lot of that kind of general language. I'm sure you
yeah.
know more about the brain than I do.
Not too much, but
Right, right,
to the extent that philosophy of mind engages in neuroscience, that's about
right.
the
And I think for this topic, it's really important to understand the brain. But so that's and what our author of the evening is going to be talking about is like the differences between what we can explain by neurons firing in our brain and this thing that he introduces that we can't explain
right. So
by that theory.
right. So what you're introducing now is the hard problem of consciousness,
That's
which
right.
I think is a great tagline for this difficulty that we all find ourselves surrounded by. And I think so. To give a little more to fill in this sort of why I want to choose this topic, I want to choose consciousness because first of all, it's I think definitely the most obvious thing that's maybe casually curious as a podcast, as the two of us, that it would be a lot of fun to jump into, which is sort of the biggest question. I think it could be argued that consciousness is the largest mystery, the biggest problem to be solved in all of humankind. I think it is quite fascinating. So that's the obvious thing. But the next thing is that more and more in contemporary thought and in the things that we're dealing with in the 21st century is involving these sorts of problems, and it's only going to increase the relevancy of what is it that's going on in the philosophy of mind that doesn't want to cleanly and quietly acquiesce to the neurosciences of the day, because it would be wonderful, I think, from the scientific perspective and people who are scientifically inclined to count this as a problem solved and there's nothing else to look into here. So neuroscience being largely, I think, it would be interesting to see the history of that, because I think from what I can understand, there's lots of domains of science that were conceived from a technology being suddenly available rather than a certain intellectual framework being conceived. So I would be interested. I think it could be the fMRI that sort of birthed the neuroscientific revolution. It was more about the brain scanning and brain imaging that was suddenly available to scientists to use, where neuroscience sort of took off. That could be wrong, and that could be wrong, but there's other examples in history, like the science of thermodynamics was actually the result of the steam engine and combustion and all of those sorts of problems. So the things like entropy and the total energy in the universe cannot be created or destroyed. That was actually came out of trains, in the 18th, 19th century. It's crazy. So anyway, I digress.
Let's get to Chalmers.
Yeah. So David Chalmers is the philosopher of mind that I think everyone should know. He's great, and he coined this term, the hard problem of consciousness, in order to differentiate that from the easy problems of consciousness. And as Rob started to say, there's this tension between a complete scientific description of what's going on in the brain. So you might summarize that as things like neurons firing. So there's certain synapses, a pattern of synapses, an action potential reaches a critical level, and then the neuron fires and all of a sudden a message is being communicated, or a sequence of causally intertwined events are happening, and you can sort of, it's intuitive, you can imagine sort of this plethora of light sort of emanating and doing all of these interesting things. And I think anyone who is thinking about consciousness, that might be the first thing you think of. So consciousness is that. There's a sort of identity, there's a identical aspect to this where that just is consciousness, this procedure of, excuse me, neurons firing.
Yes, messages being sent from the brain to other parts of the body within the brain. So just a series of physical particles, whatever a neuron is, I don't know enough about it, that goes, through the body like a message. That is consciousness, the movement of those particles.
Right.
The messages themselves.
And so that, I think, is a good place to start, because there's tons of other, understandings of this. And that, to me, that's what I thought before I took a philosophy of mind class. I was the reductionist. I was the ultimate materialist, physicalist, reductionist, and those are three.
Materialist is a word I should have.
Right, materialism and physicalism. Actually, I think physicalism is used more often, probably, or at least in Chalmers in this paper. And these are three sort of schools of philosophical thought that you wouldn't think are a philosophy. You would think that this is just synonymous with science and the scientific project, but it turns out that it's when you are looking at the other alternatives, it shrinks down to one specific school of thought, which is materialism or physicalism or reductionism. Reductionism, I think, has a more particular meaning. It means, so certain physicalist theories allow for emergent phenomenon. So the sum total of all the synapses firing result in this new phenomenon, this new property that suddenly is around. And so there's different distinctions there. So reductionism, one thing to keep in mind if we're talking about reductionism, it means that you can reduce consciousness down to the sum total of physics. So you start with the laws of physics, and the laws of physics are brute facts of the universe. And from those brute facts of the universe, you can derive everything. So the theory of everything. The complete physical picture of the universe. So that's a good little primer. And so now I think we'll get into the meat of what is this philosophical understanding of consciousness that so eludes and escapes physicalist and reductionist explanations, modes of explanation, which is so cool.
Where does shit hit the fan, Brian?
Right. Where does
how come when I'm sad, you can see in my brain that some fucking part of my brain and some neurons firing, it shows that I'm sad.
Right.
Where does it fall apart? If you can recreate sadness by, copying these messages sent to the brain, how come I can't recreate consciousness?
Great question, Rob. Let's dive in. Let's dive into where the fecal matter makes contact with the rotating blades and is subsequently splattered. Okay, you can fill in the blank. Okay.
Let's hit the fan, dude.
So I think honestly the best way to go about this is to just read some portions of this paper. So this paper is a bit long, and we're just going to stick to the first section where David Chalmers talks about the hard and easy problems of consciousness. I think that's a great place to start, and we'll just work through this and see what we think and see where
Absolutely.
it goes. All right, so I'm just gonna start at the introduction.
Please do.
So, quote, David Chalmers, facing up to the problem of consciousness is the title of this paper, which I'm sure anyone can find. We'll definitely link to it. If you're on YouTube, we'll link to it down below. If you're on SoundCloud, go on YouTube because you're missing the not only the links, you're also missing these beautiful smiling faces. in
Yeah.
all their glory. Um, so yeah, all right. So get with it. Who's on SoundCloud anymore? Aren't they bankrupt? Come on, come
Hey, don't.
on.
We're still putting our things on
If
SoundCloud
you're
as
on
well.
iTunes, let's get on iTunes. I don't even know how to put a podcast on iTunes, but
Let's get
that's
on there, Brian.
yeah, yeah. That's
Why aren't we on iTunes right now?
why am I the one responsible for this? Hey, but
You know
you
more
get
than
on iTunes, man.
me.
You're the one with the
Let's.
the music mic right now. You should know the ins and outs of Apple Music. I need to get a mic like that. That is one hell of a fucking
This is
knob.
my this is my stack of books here that's keeping the
Yeah.
mic afloat.
Wow, what a douche. Yo, you read, bro.
No.
Yeah,
Do
my
you?
Rob's in a library, and
I am in the library.
I just enjoy putting myself behind a bunch of books to make myself look smart, but it's all a conscious illusion, people. Don't be fooled. This is all shadows on the wall of the cave. Okay, all right. So,
Ooh, Vogen.
introduction,
And,
consciousness.
and Brian, do be sure to uh, tell us when you're starting and ending quotes, since you will
Oh
be
yeah,
reading,
so
reflecting
quote,
on them.
introduction, facing up to the problem of consciousness, David Chalmers. Let's go. Consciousness poses, quote, consciousness poses the most baffling problems in the science of mind. There is nothing that we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain. All sorts of mental phenomena have yielded to scientific investigation in recent years, but consciousness has stubbornly resisted. Many have tried to explain it, but the explanations always seem to fall short of the target. Some have been led to suppose that the problem is intractable and that no good explanation can be given. To make progress on the problem of consciousness, we have to confront it directly. In this paper, I first isolate the truly hard part of the problem, separating it from the more tractable parts and giving an account of why it is so difficult to explain. So, that is quote one.
So we already see this idea of separating a couple of problems
Right,
between tractable and intractable.
right, exactly. Yeah, I like that. The tractable and the intractable. The explanations missing their target, which I think is really trying to drive home the idea that lots of people are under the illusion that they are explaining what needs to be explained, and yet somehow they're missing the mark. Um, and I'll just throw this little filler in. I don't know if I mentioned David Chalmers presented this paper at a conference for consciousness. I think in like the late '90s, early 2000s. I'm not exactly sure, but he was thrown into the forefront of philosophy of mind. His popularity skyrocketed because he was able to so crisply and precisely articulate this problem of consciousness. Just a little extra food for thought. So, quote, the easy problems of consciousness are those that seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon is explained in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. The hard problems are those that seem to resist those methods. So I'll just quickly throw out the bullet points, but I'm not going to go into them because he gives some examples. So
Okay.
I'll do the examples. So Chalmers, here's a short list of the sorts of problems that he would define as the easy problems of consciousness that are tractable, that are susceptible
Yes.
to the standard methods of cognitive science, being information processing and whatever the other thing was,
Yes.
computational or
We can
neural
see
mechanisms.
this list you're about to read. We can see them in the brain.
Or they can be right to a certain degree.
Traced back to the
There
brain.
there are yeah. So we'll get into all that. So the first is the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli. The second, the integration of information by a cognitive system. 3, the reportability of mental states. 4, the ability of a system to access its own internal states. 5, the focus of attention. 6, the deliberate control of behavior. 7, the difference between wakefulness and sleep. So these are just examples. So to sort of expound on that, quote, for example, one sometimes says that a mental state is conscious when it is verbally reportable. So I am conscious. I just witnessed this, etc., etc. Or when it is internally accessible. Sometimes a system is said to be conscious of some information when it has the ability to react on the basis of that information, or more strongly, when it attends to that information, or when it can integrate that information and exploit it in the sophisticated control of behavior. We sometimes say that an action is conscious precisely when it is deliberate. Often we say that an organism is conscious as another way of saying that it is awake. There is no real issue about whether these phenomena can be explained scientifically. All of them are straightforwardly vulnerable to explanation in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. So, ... ellipses. Now I'm getting to that next point, just quick.
Oh, no.
In each case, an appropriate cognitive or neurophysiological model can clearly do the explanatory work. If these phenomena were all there was to consciousness, if these phenomena that I just laid out, those bullets that Chalmers just laid out, if these
Easy.
phenomena were all there was to consciousness, then consciousness would not be much of a problem. Although we do not yet have anything close to a complete explanation of these phenomena, we have a clear idea of how we might go about explaining them. So, these are the easy problems of consciousness.
Trace back to neural mechanisms.
Right. And I think that's pretty intuitive. And I also think that it makes sense that those are the kinds of things you would expect a scientific theory of consciousness to explain.
Yes.
Right? That's the sort of thing you would expect a neuroscientist or a cognitive scientist, what have you,
Yeah.
to explain in their theory of consciousness. So
Right.
here,
And to go back to that example of when I asked you, to bring this up, what, sadness, for instance, like any emotion like that, behavior, these problems of behavior and categorization and emotions, things like that. There are certain traceable, measurable things that are happening, phenomena that's happening in our brains. And, if someone was just looking at my brain, if neuroscience was examining the neuroactivity of my brain, they would probably know what general emotion I'm feeling because of the region of the brain and something like that. Am I
right.
right in saying that?
So right. So I think
That's an easy problem.
right. So there may be certain correlates, neural correlates to certain emotional states. So if you are in a sad state, you could find perhaps it's a particular brain region that's a correlated or associated with that feeling of the emotion. So of course, the first things you learn about when you're learning about the brain is which parts of the brain control which dimensions of deliberation and all sorts of things. The language aspect, the language part of your brain versus the motory controls, the amygdala versus the prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, there's a lot to be said in that down that road. So yes, you're right in saying that there's some sort of correlation there. So the other thing to say is we keep saying these are the easy problems of consciousness. And to any listener who hasn't heard the hard problem that we're about to lay out, you would probably be thinking, well, what the hell? Like what the fuck are they talking about? These are insanely difficult problems to tackle. How, we don't know what any of these answers are. So what is it? So what's so easy about them? And so I just want to let you know that it's not to say that these are easy problems per se, that prima facie they're just they're easy problems. No, they're incredibly difficult problems that cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, all these different people are working on currently.
Yes.
But in relation to what we're about to get to, they sort of pale in comparison.
Yeah. And I do remember Chalmers and Sam Harris saying sometimes that neuroscience, the field of neuroscience has gotten very far. I mean, there's not much more you can do as far as understanding what's happening in the brain.
Right.
The scans the technology we have to examine the brain, the amount of surgical experiences and records we have, we know what's firing in the brain when someone feels a certain way or anything like that. So neuroscience has gone pretty far with understanding those materialist
Right.
effects of consciousness.
Right. We are making headway. We're making huge leaps of progress right now. So this,
Right. But there's still this something that, according
right.
to Chalmers, is unexplainable by these things. Even
Right.
if we get super far in neuroscience,
Right.
we still will encounter this hard problem.
Okay. So to get to the hard problem, quote, the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect. As Nagel in 1974 has put it, there is something it is like to be a conscious organism. Quick digression there. I hope sometime maybe we'll jump to Nagel's really breakthrough paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" where he puts forth this understanding. So this is really critical. This is such a great way of describing this special aspect of consciousness that eludes the scientific worldview. There is something it is like to be a conscious organism. This subjective aspect is experience. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations. The felt quality of redness, the experience of dark and light, the quality of depth in a visual field. Other experience go along with perception in different modalities. So the sound of a clarinet, the smell of mothballs.
Yeah, and you're still quoting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still quoting, sorry. I am not capable of this sort of linguistic precision off the cuff. So that would be fucking awesome. That would be dope. I wouldn't be doing this shit. I would be, I don't know. I'd be fucking leading the people. I'd be a politician. Okay, so, quote, then there are bodily sensations, from pains to orgasms. Yeah, Chalmers, I love it. It's just dropping the orgasm.
Yeah.
And let me just pause right there on orgasms. I think we really should just sort of think through this quality. Is there any? I think it's arguable. I think I might put forth this thesis that the orgasm is the most conscious thing in the universe. I think the universe might just be one giant orgasm. You know what I mean? Like if God were to create the universe, you know, like in God's image, all this stuff, would it not just be his orgasm? You know, like if there's any, like, is it really his intelligence? Is it would it be his intelligence, or would it be his, you know, just that like, oh, just, you know, that like that feeling of creation, you know, when that really satisfied feeling you have after you know you get your business done and you're just like, yeah, I fucking did that shit, you know.
Yeah.
So I think it's arguable. Do you have thoughts on that, Rob?
Well, judging off of what you just said, it's really interesting you comparing like these different types of orgasms, because there's the obvious one which feels amazing, very bodily, very physical.
Yeah.
A very physical desire and feeling,
right.
but then there's this like getting your work done, you know, getting your homework done or completing a project. Or like, you know, if you're a painter, you work like, you know, months on a painting and you finally finish it, you feel amazing. It's like you can call it orgasmic, or like the way you feel in like flow state. If you're a rock star, you're playing on stage in front of millions of people and you know, you're just feeling it.
Right.
That's
right.
It's orgasmic. So
I like what started out as a really lame and terrible joke just turned into something that I think is really just so relevant to the current discussion, you know. So if you were God and you were creating all of reality as we know it, everything, would you be would you be like hunched over like a blueprint and like like connecting the dots here and there, and like the human brain is going to have this many billion neurons and this many, or would you be uh and then that's your intelligent design, or would you be like riffing on some awesome solo and just going that just like all of reality just shoots out of your out of your Stratocaster or whatever the hell it is. I don't know.
yeah, it's a
Strata.
strat. It's a strat.
That's the strat. And then reality, or would a piece of artistic creation. The artist's mind. This insight, or maybe maybe all of reality is a joke. It's just a joke in the mind of God.
Or some teenager in another universe who's just making a computer project for the fun of it.
He's or what is it, Sid from Toy Story, when he's just fucking with all of the little the baby with the nails in the head. That thing freaked me out.
Yeah, just a super advanced video game.
And we're just the toys, just like animated, like coming alive. So anyway, I digress from that hilarious joke that turned into, I think, quite a fascinating sideshow. Anyway, so all right, to quote Chalmers, to get back to it. So then there are bodily sensations from pains to orgasm, mental images that are conjured up internally, the felt quality of emotion, and the experience of a stream of conscious thought. So again, we're talking about this internal felt experience, mental images that are conjured up internally when you can picture something, the felt quality of emotion when you've ever been just lost in anger or lost in love or lost in whatever the emotion is, and the experience of a stream of conscious thought, which I think is interesting because I think you can totally just find yourself caught in these streams of thought that just sort of take you to these places. What unites, so to quote again, back to quoting, what unites all of these states is that there is something it is like to be in them. Again, to use Nagel's term there. All of them are states of experience. It is undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience. But the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea. How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, physics, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does.
Yeah.
If any problem qualifies as the problem of consciousness, it is this one. In this central sense of consciousness, an organism is conscious if there is something it is like to be that organism, and a mental state is conscious if there is something it is like to be in that state. So I thought that summary right there, that section from his paper, just does such a great job of elucidating making clear, making explicit what it is that we're talking about here.
Yes, and I don't think it'll be a new problem for
Right.
people to hear, for people to think about, because it's just so well articulated in the intellectual community, in the philosophy of mind community, maybe even in the neuroscientific community. This was the first time someone articulated the difference between these things so well. But I remember going back to my story about learning about reductionism and materialism in college, and thinking there's something missing here.
Right.
And then I was pretty influenced by my teacher, who identifies herself as a pragmatist.
Hmm.
A professor I had from school. She actually taught one of the coolest classes, man, Harry Potter and philosophy.
Right. That is my wheelhouse, or should I say, wizard castle.
You would have loved it, dude. She's the one who introduced me to William James.
Oh hell yeah, man.
You're a big William James guy, I know.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't want to get too off topic here, but I remember thinking in that class, like, there's something missing here. And then my teacher is like very on the side of, the hard problem of consciousness, where there's,
Right. Right.
you never fully understand or explain the subjective experience.
Right.
So I think it's not new for people to understand, but for them to hear it in this way is pretty cool. It's really making this academic paper really accessible.
Right. And so, just to get back to so what's the big deal here?
What is it?
The big deal here is that all of the things that Chalmers was talking about in the easy problem, you can sort of write down on a piece of paper. You can sort of give these formulas. X leads to Y, which leads to Z, which leads to alpha, which leads to zeta, which leads to blah, blah, blah. No matter how we understand the mechanism, how does a mechanism get to subjective experience? How does the explanation of the mechanism suddenly leap into this understanding of, oh, well, that's why yellow looks like yellow. There's even this weird gap between the word yellow and what it is that I'm trying to get at, and what it is that the hard problem of consciousness is trying to get at. We know it when we see it, and yet, how do you even go about describing that experience? Does yellow capture the experience of yellow? Does a breakdown in the light spectrum and talking about the wavelength of the radiation of the light spectra that is giving you this experience as it hits your retina and it interacts with your neurons, and your neurons fire in a certain way, does that come anywhere close? Does that at any moment suddenly give you the insight into, oh, that's what this thing that is yellow is? It doesn't even, to me, it seems obvious that I can't even imagine a way in which this story works. I can't even imagine a way this causal chain or this explanatory chain suddenly gets to what David Chalmers is talking about as experience. And if I may give one more technical label to this, this is called the explanatory gap. And this is what we're talking about. In the hard problem of consciousness, what Chalmers is articulating is an explanatory gap. There is one way to explain the physical phenomena, the phenomena of mechanism, and there is another way to explain, or perhaps what we're talking about here, experience, escapes all linguistic or information-based explanation at all. Maybe there's something interesting going on there, or I shouldn't say information, or mathematical or what have you. There's this gap. There's this seemingly unbridgeable gap. How do we cross it? How do we cross it? And that's what the rest of this paper talks about, is the different strategies that different schools of philosophy of mind have deployed in order to, or sort of, his point is that all of these different approaches have failed in bridging the explanatory gap.